It was 100 years ago this year, I believe 100 years ago last month, that Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, kicking off World War I, at least according to the conventional story. And I've been, in fact, we've talked about this on the air a few times, wanting to get somebody on who really understands World War I to tell us, what were the lessons of World War I and what might they be for today as well. Adam Hochschild is with us. He is a journalist, co-founder of Mother Jones Magazine, the author of 7 books, including To End All Wars, a story of loyalty and rebellion, 1914 to 1918. Of course, those being the years of World War I. Adam, welcome to the program.
Good to be with you, Tom.
Thanks so much for joining us. So, first of all, what kicked off World War I? By the way, I should add, you wrote this brilliant piece in the New York Times in the op-ed pages, Colonial Folly, European Suicide, that I just want to recommend to everybody. What started World War I?
Well, that's a big, complicated question that people have been wondering about for 100 years. In fact, 100 years ago today, the first actual shots of the war were fired. 100 years ago yesterday, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, and 100 years ago today, Austro-Hungarian artillery and gunboats on the Danube began actually shelling Serbia. I think the main thing that kicked off the war was that people on both sides were optimistic that they could win quickly. They felt that way, and this was something I've argued both in my book and in this piece in the New York Times today, because when the generals looked back at other previous wars they thought they could learn from, they cherry-picked. And what they seemed to be most thinking in terms of were the colonial wars, because these were what British, French, and German officers had experienced prior to 1914. They had all been officers, or all the leading generals had been officers in colonial wars in Africa and Asia, where they were up against very poorly armed colonial rebels of one sort or another in India, in Africa, in China, and they prevailed quite quickly. They were the ones, the European armies, that had the machine guns, the mobile artillery pieces, the repeating rifles, and usually the Africans and Asians they were up against had few or none of these things. And even though they logically knew that the other side that they were going to be fighting in a world war in Europe was armed with machine guns, they still behaved as if they were up against these poorly armed colonial rebels. They didn't prepare for it. They didn't occur to most of the armies in 1914, for example, that their soldiers ought to be equipped with metal helmets.
Right.
It didn't occur to the French army that they shouldn't send their men into battle with bright red caps, bright blue coats, and bright red pants, which of course made them, even more visible targets.
Right. The British made that same mistake.
The other side.
They made that same mistake in the late 1770s, did they not?
They did. Well, of course, the British were wearing their famous red coats right up until the 1880s. And, if you're fighting somebody who's just got swords and spears, that doesn't matter so much, and you can enjoy looking fierce and splendid and colorful.
Right.
But they didn't plan for the fact that the other side also had this fearsome new weapon, the machine gun.
Arnold Toynbee, it's perhaps apocryphal, but Arnold Toynbee makes the point that, or is quoted as having said, when the last man who remembers the horrors of the last great war dies, the next great war becomes inevitable because only the glories are remembered. And if you look back, Abraham Lincoln thought that the Civil War would be over in 3 weeks. George W. Bush, when we went into Iraq, having seen Reagan take out Grenada in 4 days, and some of these little small wars, his father, for example, kicking Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait in 100 hours, they were quite clear that the Iraq war would be over in a matter of weeks, at the months at the very most, and it was the longest war in our, well, actually Afghanistan is outdistancing it, the second longest war in our history. Is this to use a Bushism, misunderestimation of the real cost, consequence, and difficulty and unpredictability of war. Is this a common theme in history, or am I just cherry-picking Iraq and the Civil War and the Vietnam War, too? I mean, Lyndon Johnson thought that would be, in his conversations, now the tapes are out, his conversations with Dean Rusk, and I'm forgetting the name of his Secretary of Defense.
McNamara.
McNamara, yeah. They thought that the thing would be over in 3 to 6 months as soon as we seriously started bombing those guys, Is this a common theme in history?
I think it's very common, and that there's a real thread that connects, George W. Bush landing on that aircraft carrier after, a few weeks after the invasion of Iraq in front of that big sign that said "Mission Accomplished." There's a thread that goes right back to Kaiser Wilhelm II in 1914, telling his generals to go ahead with their plan that had Paris captured and France surrendering on the 42nd day. And then he told his troops, "You will be home before the leaves fall from the trees." Everybody starting a war always wants to think, first of all, that it's going to be over very quickly. Second, that they'll be victorious. And thirdly, that it's going to solve a problem rather than create unimaginable consequences that they have no idea of. I think if, in the old days, they used to give wars more colorful names than now. The War of the Spanish Succession, the Whiskey Rebellion, the War of Jenkins' Ear, and so forth. I think World War I should really be called the War of Unintended Consequences.
Right.
Because every country went to war with a fairly limited aim. Austria-Hungary wanted to wipe little Serbia off the map. The Russians wanted to come to the aid of their fellow Slavs in Serbia. Germany wanted to establish its dominance over Russia and Eastern Europe and just get France out of the way to begin with, minor problem. Nobody expected a world war. Nobody expected a war that would spread to many continents and it would last 4.5 years and leave the world worse off in every conceivable way, in addition to having a vast death toll, and make a second world war almost inevitable.
Right. Well, and in fact, John Maynard Keynes, I believe it was, famously wrote that if the Treaty of Versailles were put into place, it would cause the Second World War. Was he not prescient?
I think he was. George Kennan expressed it in writing about the Treaty of Versailles, that the tragedies of the future were written into it as if with the devil's own hand.
Whoa.
And one of the things that was fascinating to me in studying the First World War for 6 years to write my book is that I saw a little bit more clearly than I had realized before about just how that process happened.
Right.
We tend to focus on the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles and how they stirred up German resentment and how Hitler played on that and so forth. But there's another part of the story that we don't tell so frequently, which is that the German people thought when armistice was signed that it was really an armistice and not a surrender.
Right.
Then they discovered really it was a surrender. They'd been fed this diet of triumphal propaganda right up to the last minute.
Right, and then the humiliation that Hitler exploited as he rose to power. We'll continue this conversation in just a moment. We're talking with Adam Hochschild. He is a journalist, co-founder of Mother Jones, author of 7 books, including To End All Wars. We'll be right back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And he teaches at Berkeley, journalism.berkeley.edu. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Adam, you're still with us?
I sure am.
Is there any chance that we could talk? I could talk with you over your phone. We can continue to hold the video, but if you could just pick your phone up, because the Skype audio really sounds funky on this end.
Okay, so you can hear me a little better by phone?
Oh, infinitely better. Yeah, you're so much clearer. And so if we can do that, it looks just fine that you're on the phone. We were talking about the Treaty of Versailles. For people who don't know what we're talking about, you want to set that up?
Yeah, the Treaty of Versailles was the treaty that formally ended the First World War after the fighting came to a stop at 11 a.m. on November 11th, 1918. And it was called the armistice, but it wasn't really an armistice. It was a surrender by Germany. But the German people had been told right up to the last minute that they were about to triumph, and indeed several months earlier their armies had been on the verge of capturing Paris, and there were just temporary setbacks since then. And German troops marched home from the front and were greeted by parades and people throwing flowers and so on when they marched into German cities. And then it sank in slowly that, in fact, really it was a surrender. And moreover, the Allied blockade of Germany that had prevented Germany from importing any food during the war and had led to widespread near famine it continued for 7 months after the war ended, right up until Germany signed the Treaty of Versailles. So people were still, in many cities, in a state of near starvation. That left a bitter legacy of resentment, and then, of course, Hitler played on that brilliantly, saying that the German armies were about to win the war, which wasn't really true, until they were stabbed in the back by communist pacifists and Jews, and we know what happened after that.
Right, right, and is it? I've heard this story. I can't. If I read it, I can't remember where, but it's been my belief for many years. Please disabuse me of the notion if I'm incorrect, that the reason for the German hyperinflation that followed World War I was in part, a lack of materials and food and things, but perhaps more significantly was the German government intentionally reducing the value of the Deutschmark so that they could repay reparations with devalued currency. Is that true?
I don't think so. I unfortunately don't have the books at hand where I could quickly look that up. I don't think so because I think the reparations terms were put in terms of the currency of the victors.
Rather than in Deutschmarks.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. So did Germany ever fulfill their obligations under the Treaty of Versailles?
Well, they fulfilled some, but not others. The reparations terms were actually lowered in later years, but they never did fully pay them. But they'd already done the work of becoming the thing that Hitler could point to as a reason why Germany had been humiliated and had to go to war again. And then, of course, Germany began violating the terms of the treaty by doing things like reoccupying the Rhineland in the 1930s.
Right. We'll continue in just a moment. Adam Hochschild is with us. He is a journalist, co-founder of Mother Jones, author of 7 books, including To End All Wars, the story of loyalty and rebellion, 1914 to 1918. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Adam Hochschild is on the line with us. He is a journalist, co-founder of Mother Jones, author of 7 books, including the book about World War I, To End All Wars, a story of loyalty and rebellion, 1914 to 1918. Available from all the usual suspects. And Adam, we talked in the first segment about how often we miss our leaders and our people, for that matter. I mean, typically leaders don't go to war unless the people are calling for it or at least tolerant of it. How we underestimate what we're stepping into, both in terms of immediate consequences and very rarely even consider long-term consequences. And then, we also talked about how the Treaty of Versailles, how you can screw up the peace. I think Charlie Wilson's war, the parts of it at least that are not apocryphal, is another good example of that. We helped the Mujahideen throw the Soviets out of Afghanistan, and then when they came to us and said, now help us build schools and cities and rebuild our infrastructure, we said, tough luck, Charlie, see you later. And in steps the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. How do you see this playing out today? These lessons being not learned, or do you see? And do you see any? I've seen probably 6 or 7 op-eds in the last 4 or 5 months in the Financial Times, comparing today to 1914 and essentially predicting we're on the edge of another world war as a consequence of similar interlocking treaties and nationalism and arrogance and all these kind of things. Curious your thoughts on that as well.
Well, I actually don't think we're on the verge of another world war, but I do think that we're under the same illusions at times, and certainly the Iraq and Afghanistan wars have been spectacular and tragic examples of this. We're under the illusion that because we have the latest and best military technology, if we just use it, it's going to solve a problem. It's going to get rid of an evil dictator, Saddam Hussein, and things will be much better. And we don't stop to think that, just as when Austria-Hungary thought, well, we'll invade Serbia and get this small country out of the way, that it might lead to other problems, we don't stop to think that when you use tremendous concentrated violence, it has all sorts of after effects that create problems that you never dreamed of. I mean, who could have imagined the horrible mess in Iraq today resulting from U.S. invasion, more than 10 years ago? But I think it is sort of a result of that. Not that, Iraq would have been a paradise if we hadn't invaded, but there are always tremendous consequences to using tremendous amounts of violence, and unpredictable consequences, too. So I just think we should be very, very cautious about getting into any new situations like this. And you look at history, and that sure is one of the lessons that you see.
Two of the proposed routes to a world war, or at least a war that involves multiple nations, that I've seen in various op-eds and people are opining about, that could go viral, could go large as a consequence of these countries having interlocking mutual defense treaties with other countries, are one, the conflict between, actually it's a conflict right now, between Japan and China, and possibly even Taiwan and China, and possibly South Korea and China, and this becoming a regional conflict, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan becoming allies, dragging us into it, China dragging Russia into it, that kind of thing. That's one. The other one that has been discussed a couple of times, I've seen in op-ed pages and whatnot by people who present themselves as students of history, is the Ukraine, the situation in Ukraine, where when the original dissolution of the Soviet Union essentially was negotiated between Reagan and later George Herbert Walker Bush and Mr. Gorbachev, the commitment was made by the United States that there would never be a NATO presence in the buffer countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Ukraine, specifically and particularly Ukraine, which is right on Russia's border. And now we broke that deal during the Clinton years with Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. We followed with Poland, I think, 7 years ago during Bush, 8, 9 years ago. I don't remember exactly when. And now this new deal that Ukraine just signed with Europe, with the EU, includes a NATO self-defense, mutual self-defense peace. It's not an official declaration of association with NATO, but the Russians are reading it that way. Do you see either of those? And then, of course, everybody constantly points to the Israeli-Palestinian Middle East. Look at the mess. In part, perhaps even driven by global warming, as so many of these North African and Middle Eastern countries running out of food. Do you see any of these as touch points? We have about a minute left. I'm sorry, it's a big question and not a lot of time.
I do see them all as danger spots where I just think it's important to be very cautious and to remember that however much we might despise, for example, Vladimir Putin and what he's done, he is a terrible guy and very aggressive, very nasty what he's trying to do there. But we don't want to do anything which could push that situation into a continental war.
Right.
And I just think we have to be very cautious about finding ways of responding that don't involve threats of military force.
And in Asia and in the Middle East?
Same thing there. And I think in the Middle East, for example, we'd be better off if we withdrew some of the military aid that we've been giving so heavily to Israel over the years, which essentially gives Israel the feeling they can do whatever they want and the United States will back them up. I would withdraw that support.
Very interesting. Adam Hochschild, he is the author of To End All Wars, a story of loyalty and rebellion, 1914-1918, and a great op-ed in the New York Times you can find over on their website, titled Continental Folly, European Suicide. Thank you so much for being with us today, sir.
Thank you, Tom. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. We'll be back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 866-987-THOM.
And Adam's book, once again, is To End All Wars. Of course, World War I was referred to as the war to end all wars, right? Didn't quite work out that way. We'll be back.